me say that it's a pleasure to be here and to take part in a program with the Ashbrook Center. I was actually quite familiar with John Ashbrook's work on the Internal Security Committee, and actually he was in the forefront of an examination of some of the things I'm going to talk about today. Terrorism, active aggression. And by that, I interpret the subject to mean the involvement of a number of states, Soviet Union, East European states, and a number of other states in promoting and assisting terrorist and insurgent movements around the world. And in our most recent book from the Fletcher School, I'll get a plug in for the book, Hydra of Carnage, International Linkages of Terrorism. One of the things that we try to do, we annually at the Fletcher School have a conference, International Security Studies conference, on an important subject that deals with some aspect of foreign and defense policy. Last year we examined these international linkages of terrorism. We usually invite a number of specialists to speak. Our keynote speaker last year was William Casey. But in putting the book together, the first part, which consists of the articles by people who spoke, including the members of the faculty, I said to Uri Renan, our chairman, that I don't think that it's quite enough simply to have these articles, that what we need to put in the book is primary evidence, material documentation that shows the linkages between states and terrorist organizations. Now, you may recall that this has been a very controversial subject, not only in the field of international relations, but within the U.S. government. For instance, when Alexander Haig first, when he became Secretary of State, he forcefully spoke out on the Soviet connection to terrorist groups. And within the intelligence community, there was quite a bit of opposition, saying that well, there's not enough evidence to support this thesis. In other words, a question of verification came up, and they took the position in they put out special reports called National Intelligence Estimates. And they put out an estimate which more or less said that you couldn't show a connection between the Soviet Union or Soviet surrogates. By surrogates, I mean states like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Cuba, client states, that you couldn't demonstrate that. And this debate continued into the period following the attempted papal assassination. And it continues today, so that in light of this, I felt, and my colleagues felt, that it was essential to attempt to provide such primary evidence in a book like this. I think only through an examination of that evidence can we judge the extent and nature of the international linkages, as well as how grave the threat may be to the United States and the West. We were, and I have to admit, we were skeptical of assertions of the assertion that state-sponsored international infrastructure for planning and conducting these activities is impossible to expose or does not exist at all. We were skeptical of that, but nonetheless, we felt that, well, it may not be possible for scholars operating in an open realm as opposed to classified material. We were all professors, so we didn't work with classified material. It might not be possible for us to gather such information. Maybe it was beyond the scope of our capabilities. However, I have to say that we were very wrong on that. And in the second section of the book, in the documentation, we actually titled this a plethora of documentation. A great deal of documentation exists. We found quite a bit that shows the linkages between terrorists and guerrilla movements and their patrons in Moscow, in Havana, in Sofia, in East Berlin, Tehran, Damascus, and elsewhere. The evidence actually breaks down into two categories. The first is testimony by defectors. Now, defectors is a bit of an unfortunate word, but it's one we use. Testimony by people who were in rather unique positions. They were in Soviet intelligence, or they were in Czechoslovakian intelligence, or Nicaraguan intelligence, or Cuban, or people who were in foreign ministry or in special military or special departments that deal with political and psychological warfare. We think that's a very unique source of material that has not been used very effectively by our own intelligence organizations. And we put some of this in the book. By the way, it's, the testimony presented here is only a small portion of a much larger project we're working on. We're trying to get through the eyes of those who were involved how the whole apparatus for making decisions, for operationalizing them, for coordinating activities, how that works from the Soviet Union into the Eastern Bloc countries, into Cuba, Nicaragua, through its surrogates. And we're trying to look at a 20-year period. So that work continues at Fletcher. We are fortunate enough to have a very nice research grant, and we will probably interview about 25 such personalities. The interviews usually run 2 days, so you can imagine that the information we're gathering is extensive, quite a bit of work. We have a good group of very talented graduate students that work with the faculty, and we're pleased with that. But we put some of that evidence in here. We also found a great deal of material that's been captured in different places. For instance, when the Israelis went into southern Lebanon, they found an enormous amount of documentation, PLO documentation. When we intervened in Grenada, the Grenada archives that we collect have an enormous amount of documentation, material captured in Central America, in Europe, and elsewhere. Show these connections also. For instance, written arrangements between officials of terrorist organizations and their state sponsors. Terrorist and insurgent agreements among themselves, and actual textual records. So we put some of that material in here. Actually, our biggest problem was eliminating stuff, to be honest. When we first went to the publisher, the manuscript was much larger, and they came back and said, "No way, you know, this book will cost too much." And so we had to cut it down, and we got it down to about 300 pages of primary evidence. It divides up geographically. We look at Central America, we look at Africa, the Middle East, Europe. There's also a section on the connection between narcotics traffickers, terrorists and guerrilla movements, and some states, including Cuba. So we have that material. Now, let me suggest that we think for the first time in a single work, you can see how this network or infrastructure fits together. And while we don't purport to reveal every linkage, we think the evidence compiled here demonstrates the increasing dimensions of the linkages between communist states and terrorist and insurgent organizations. And what I'd like to do is to talk a bit about, briefly, about, first of all, how this fits into Soviet strategy. It's important, I think, to put it in the proper context, and we work quite a bit on Soviet strategy. So talk a bit about how it fits in there, and then I'll spend time on maybe one case study, because it's always interesting to see a case study of Central America, and then I'll leave for questions, and if you want to ask about other regions, because I mean we have quite a bit on the Middle East and on Grenada and on Europe and so on. The Soviets used the term active measures to define or to explain their strategy for promoting a whole range of what the Defense Department now likes to call low-intensity operations or low-intensity conflict. This includes terrorism, guerrilla warfare, variety of forms of unconventional conflict. And the Soviets utilize, it's interesting, both political and paramilitary or military instruments to promote this form of conflict. Now, it's easy enough to understand the military side. I mean, terrorists and insurgents need guns, they need training in how to use munitions and so on. But the political side is also very, very important. The Soviets will use political measures, what we might call political action, propaganda, activities in the international arena, in international organizations. They create international front groups. And the objective here is to try to legitimize the activities of terrorist organizations and of insurgent organizations. One of the ones that they've really focused quite a bit of this political action effort on is the PLO. And to take a look at Soviet front group and political action in international organizations in the UN on behalf of legitimizing the PLO and discrediting Israel gives you a good idea of how important they think political action is, so that it's much easier to justify and support a movement if it's recognized, for instance, by an international organization as the sole legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people. They use these political measures not only for the PLO, but for a number of in what they call national liberation movements. SWAPO, the guerrilla movement in Namibia. They used the same kind of techniques for the MPLA of Angola and so on. Now, they can't use them for all terrorist and insurgent groups because some just don't have any credibility and legitimacy. But where they can, they will use these political measures to build up the legitimacy of the movement. Now, they also will use paramilitary assistance. And what I mean by that is not just the provision of arms, but also political and military training and advisory support. For instance, you'll find not so much Soviets, but Cubans and East Germans and some others in training camps in Nicaragua, training not just Salvadorian guerrillas, but a number of other terrorists and guerrilla elements from around Latin America. So they use these paramilitary capabilities to advise and support. And that includes, by the way, intelligence information and other kinds of assistance. Now, the Soviets, I want to suggest, do use surrogates quite a bit in all these operations. To me, that's one of the interesting new developments. It's not really all that new. But one that we've become more and more concerned with, and that is surrogate combat, how the Soviets can call on a variety of East Europeans, specialists, Cuban specialists, now Nicaraguan specialists, to provide unique kinds of assistance and capabilities. And I think that these surrogates have become quite specialized. I said that it's something that we've been concerned with recently, but really nothing new. One of our interviews was with General Jan Šejna. Šejna was a senior Czech military and intelligence officer, a general. And in the interview, one of the things we discussed with him was when did you actually receive instructions from the Soviets to start to provide specialized assistance to terrorist groups and insurgent groups? And he said that in 1964, actually, the Soviet Union brought together the different East European intelligence organizations. Now, the Soviets pretty much, it's not an unfair term to say they own those intelligence organizations. I mean, the Bulgarian intelligence does not operate on its own. Czech intelligence does not operate on its own. It has Soviet KGB officials who are at the working level in those intelligence organizations. Šejna said that they were brought together and they had their first discussions actually in 1964 of what the Czechs would do and what guerrilla and terrorist organizations they should start to work with, what the Bulgarians would do, and so on. So the use of surrogates, or at least the Soviet intention to begin to use surrogates in this capacity goes back to the 60s. Now, things take time, and it's really not until in the early 70s that we start to get a good view of how the surrogates are involved in Soviet strategy for promoting insurgency and terrorism. By the late 70s, we get a much better picture of that. And certainly by the 80s now, we have, I think, a pretty clear view. And I'll talk a bit about, I'll give you some examples in a little bit. Now, in addition to promoting low-level violence or low-intensity conflict, one of the interesting things that Moscow and its surrogates have been involved in that relates to this is to help movements that come to power or are part of a movement that topples a government, to help them consolidate control quickly, so then that state can be used as a base area. The objective here is to establish surrogate areas out from the Soviet Union. And what they generally do is they will, Nicaragua is a good example that I'll use. The Nicaraguan revolution was really not a Sandinista revolution. It was a revolution of the Sandinistas and a variety of other parties, business community, church, social democrats, unions. But once Somoza fell, the Soviets moved quickly with the Cubans to help the FSLN, a small element, consolidate power. And the way they do this is to get in quickly and to gain access to the intelligence agency and to the military, and to help consolidate control within those areas pretty quickly. Now, once that happens in a place like Nicaragua, then these advisors can turn around and start to set up base areas for training guerrillas and insurgents in the region. And that's actually what we saw happen in Nicaragua. So you have two parts to this Soviet strategy. On the one hand, they want to assist insurgent and terrorist movements, whether or not they can come to power. But those that can come to power, then once they get in there, the Soviets come in quickly with support and assistance to help them consolidate control and then to try to use that area. And I'll talk about Central America in my case study as one example to give you a good picture of what took place. In the Central American case, we worked with a couple of individuals who had been inside. One fellow was a counterintelligence officer who was a Sandinista. He fought in the revolution. After the revolution, he went into state security in the counterintelligence realm. Now, counterintelligence generally has a couple of functions. One is to ensure internal security, to make sure that that no opposition can get rolling, to keep it becomes almost the eyes and ears of the party. Now, in communist states, internal security is a first function. It's a primary objective. If you take a look at the Soviet Union, for instance, the KGB, which we read a lot about their activities in the United States and in the West, in espionage and the stealing of technology and involvement with terrorists. But you might not know this, that the KGB's external functions take up the time of about 15% of KGB personnel and financial support, that the great majority of the KGB activities are focused internally. Now, they do a lot externally. The KGB, size-wise, it's estimated, is about 500,000. They have their own army. And they've used some of these forces externally. This is an aside, but in Afghanistan and elsewhere. So internal security is very, very important. And what we saw in the Nicaraguan case in talking with this particular counterintelligence officer who served until 1983, he found out he did really well. And so he was picked to go to the Soviet Union and study at the KGB higher school for 5 years. That was even too much for him. And he took a gun and commandeered a plane and flew to Costa Rica. But he had some interesting insights, and in his testimony, he outlined the role of the KGB, the Cuban intelligence, which is called the DGI, East German intelligence, Bulgarian intelligence, their role both in helping the Sandinistas seize power and to consolidate control and to develop Nicaragua as a base from which to promote insurgency and terrorism in the region. He, by the way, pointed out that within Nicaraguan intelligence, now intelligence is generally divided into two shops, if you will, what they call positive intelligence or foreign intelligence, deals with external activity, and counterintelligence, internal. And he, within both sides of Nicaraguan state security apparatus, you find Cuban intelligence advisors occupying positions at all levels of the intelligence organization, right down to the working level. So, in fact, the head of the foreign intelligence in Nicaragua is a Cuban, longtime associate of the FSLN, who comes out of the DGI. And the head of the counterintelligence side, a fellow named Lenin Cerna, close associate of the DGI for years. Now, following the revolution, the FSLN cadre were sent to Cuba to be trained in intelligence and counterintelligence matters immediately, so that once it was over, even while you still had this large coalition of social democrats and business community and so on, the FSLN was moving to consolidate power within the internal security and military mechanisms, because those are the ones that control power. You know, unions can be powerful, but if you control state security in the military, you have the real means of coercion. And this fellow we interviewed was sent immediately to Cuba to be trained in counterintelligence methods. He actually was trained in how to work against foreign North Americans who would come to Nicaragua to see the revolution. I asked him, I said, you know, it's interesting, who were your classmates? Who else was receiving this training? And he said they had their Grenadans, so there were people from Grenada, Ethiopians, and Angolans, all receiving the same kind of training, which I thought was interesting, that here little Cuba would be bringing people from as far as Africa for this kind of specialized training. In addition to Cubans, there were a number of Bulgarians who were operating and advising Nicaraguan intelligence. You also had KGB who served as senior advisors. So within state security, the Soviets and their surrogates had penetrated pretty quickly. I mean, by the early 80s, they were directing Nicaraguan intelligence and counterintelligence. You also found Soviet surrogates involved in other, what I would call, power consolidation measures, most importantly within the Army. One of the other people we interviewed was Eden Pastora. Now, Pastora, remember, was the famous hero of the revolution and had led the famous assault on the legislature in '77, which got a lot of publicity. And he fought on the Southern Front, which was against the best elements of Somoza's National Guard, the ones that were led actually by Somoza's son. So Pastor was a little late in getting to Managua, and he, a few weeks late. And he said when he got there, it was interesting, he walked into the Somoza bunker, which was now FSLN headquarters. And see, he had been taken into the FSLN as a social democratic representative. And he said already there were KGB generals who were in place, and it was a very short time that the Soviets provided a big military package. He actually went to Moscow to negotiate that package, and he met with General Ustinov, who was the defense minister and chairman of the military. So imagine how important the Soviets must have thought of this if they had the marshal of the Soviet Union meeting with Eden Pastora. So you saw Soviets and other Soviet surrogates involved in training and preparing the military. And of course, this training involves not just military, but cadre political training. Now, in addition to that, the Cuban DGI, within the Cuban Communist Party, there is a Department of the Americas. The Department of the Americas specializes in political and psychological warfare. For instance, one of the things that the Nicaraguans have done a lot of is to try to, and the Salvadorian guerrillas, to try to bring people down to that region who will then oppose administration policy in the region. So these group, the Americas Department, is involved in this kind of political action. And the Americas Department set up almost a sister department in Nicaragua called the Department of International Relations. The Americas Department, interesting enough, is modeled almost completely on the International Department of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So what's interesting to me as a student of this is to see these parallel structures, so that the International Department, which may be involved in a political warfare campaign in support of the PLO, will be able to draw on countries as far away as Central America to conduct political action in the UN. So it's a fascinating institutional arrangement. The other interesting department from the Cuban Communist Party was the Department of Special Operations. Their job essentially is to train guerrillas and terrorists, and it was DOE, as it's called, or Special Operations, that set up these training camps in southern Nicaragua, in which Salvadorian guerrillas are trained, as well as what they call internationalist elements, receive training there and provide training there. These international elements include former members of the Tupamaros, the Montañeros, the M19 from Colombia, and a number of other similar guerrilla and terrorist groups, so that Nicaragua then becomes a base in which a regional base for promoting low-intensity violence in Central and South America. And Miguel Bolaños Hunter, who was the interviewee, said that it was clear, there was this clear set of priorities, and Salvador was the main target. They really believed that on the heels of Nicaragua, you could almost take the strategy and the operations and shift it right into Salvador and do the same thing. The other person we interviewed on Nicaragua was Eden Pastora, of course, very important figure. And Pastora outlined for us not only what took place after the revolution, but how the Soviets and the Cubans got in with the FSLN in 77, 78. For a long time, the Sandinistas were split into three factions, or what they called tendencies. And these differences were over strategy, not over whether or not they would be Marxist-Leninists. They were all Marxist-Leninists. The question was, how do you seize power? And some wanted to follow classic Maoist doctrine, which means you have to go and labor in the mountains for a decade. Others didn't like that idea, wanted to hurry things up and thought maybe you could create an insurrection in the city. Others were more aligned to Leninist thinking as it emerged in the Bolshevik Revolution, but they were getting nowhere. And actually, the disagreements were rather hostile. Sometimes they shot at one another. And what Castro did was he called these guys together in 77, and he told them, he said, if you want my support, and that translates into guns and ammunition, you guys better get together and form a coalition. And Pastora laid out how that took place, and they did form a coalition. It was an interesting political action on the part of Castro, who then turned around and did the same thing in 1980 with the Salvadorian guerrillas, who were having the same kind of arcane disagreements. So that in 78, once this coalition begins to be formed, and certainly by 79 for the final offensive, the Cubans are transporting a great deal of equipment into Nicaragua through Costa Rica, and this really gives the guerrilla elements the military punch that they didn't have before to knock out the Somoza's National Guard. Now, in terms of power consolidation, I had mentioned Pastor laid out not only the development of the army, but the development of these special bases for them promoting terrorism in the region. Now, we include in the book a number of other documents which have been captured in Central America and really show how the Soviet Union and its surrogates are involved with the Salvadorian guerrillas. Literally trying to follow the strategy of Nicaragua. One interesting document is of a trip that the head of the Salvadorian Communist Party, Shafiq Handel, General Secretary, Salvadorian Communist Party, took in the early 80s. Now, this was after this coalition had been forged. And in 1981, the Salvadorians tried to follow the same final offensive strategy that the Nicaraguans did in '79 that brought them to power. It didn't work, mainly because in Salvador, they're up against a centrist government that's really carrying out reforms and is actually doing quite well with its military now. And so the final offensive failed at that time. But prior to that, they needed guns and ammunition. They were getting a lot through Cuba. But Shafiq Handel, in a document we put in here, describes his trip to various countries in search of arms and other supplies. And his account reveals really this international infrastructure for acquiring guns and other equipment, and then moving it into the target area. Handel arranged for arms to be smuggled to Salvador from Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, the East Germany, Hungary, Vietnam, and Ethiopia. His report shows concerted steps by the Soviet Union and its allies to actually cover up their tracks. So, for instance, the Soviets themselves at that time would not provide equipment. The Czechs would, but the Czechs would only provide equipment that they also flooded the international arms black market with, so that having Czech weapons show up in Salvador wouldn't necessarily, from the Soviet perspective, show a link to the East European countries, because these arms can be bought freely on the world market. In Vietnam, Vietnam agreed to transport a large number of U.S. weapons to Salvador. As you may know, when we left from the rooftops, we didn't take all the ammunition with us and guns with us. There's a large amount of American weaponry there that now is being put on the black market and also transported to places like El Salvador. So you see this in this document, as well as his meeting with senior level communist officials in all these countries to arrange the deal. Now, I noted earlier that Castro played an important role in unifying the Sandinistas. A captured document from Salvador shows Castro playing the same role with the Salvadorian guerrillas. In a letter dated in 1979, the three key factions of the Salvadorian guerrillas, the FARN, CPES, the Communist Party, and the People's Liberation Army, announced a solidarity agreement and thanked Castro for his help in putting this agreement together and bringing about the unification. And in other letters addressed from the heads of the Salvadorian guerrillas to Manuel Pinheiro is the head of this Americas department and one of Castro's senior longtime officials. We find that the Salvadorian guerrillas provide the Cuban leadership actually with operational details and ask their advice concerning different situations on the ground. Should we do this or that? And we're thinking about appointing this guy to this command, and do you think it would be a good idea? So you can see that the coordination between states and between these terrorist and insurgent movements is at the operational level, and I find that to be pretty fascinating. Now, I mentioned that one of the things that the Soviets do is to try to build up the international support and legitimacy of these movements, and there are a number of documents in here that show the Soviet use of international front organizations in order to promote the cause of these groups. And one interesting report that we have in here, another captured document, really shows the importance of building building public opinion support for the Salvadorian guerrillas in the United States. And this is the report by Farad Handel, the brother of Shafiq Handel, of his trip to the United States to develop and expand what he called the Solidarity movement in the U.S. He presents himself in the report as the representative of the National Democratic Union. That's simply the Communist Party's legal front. The notes established that the Salvadorian Solidarity movement in the United States is a target of Salvadorian guerrillas, and that they hope to penetrate and influence it. It's interesting that approximately half of these solidarity groups, approximately half the solidarity groups he met with were headed by members of the U.S. Peace Council, which is the U.S. extension of the World Peace Council, one of the main Soviet front groups, were actually members of the U.S. Communist Party. Also prominent among the leaders are Salvadorian members of these various guerrilla groups that have emigrated to the United States, but they're really carrying out political activity in support of the revolution in Salvador by trying to build political opposition to U.S. involvement there. While in the United States, Handel linked up with Cuba in the UN. He went to meet with the Cubans, and the Cubans advised him on who he should meet with in Washington, and actually identified members of Congress that the Cubans thought would be friendly to his cause. While in New York City, he met with representatives of the PLO and also with representatives of CISPAS. CISPAS is the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. It's an extension, really, of a Soviet front group, and it was headed by a woman named Sandy Pollock, a longtime member of the U.S. Communist Party who died tragically recently in an airplane crash flying from Managua to, or actually from Havana to Managua. Additionally, he recounts in the document his work. Actually, when he went up to the Congress, he was allowed to use certain congressional offices to prepare material for Congress on why we shouldn't give any support to the Duarte government. So it was an interesting political action. We often think that support for these kinds of activities, terrorism and insurgency, is simply guns and ammunition, but it's equally important in a pluralistic society. The Soviets and their surrogates believe, anyway, to try to splinter and to try to build opposition and solidarity movements. That doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that people that are involved in these peace movements and so on are simply representatives of the Soviet Union. They're targeted by these groups, and it's a long-term process. It's been going on for years. I did a book with a fellow from Georgetown University entitled Desinformatsia, or Disinformation, Active Measures in Soviet Strategy, in which we look at how the Soviets use front groups for this sort of activity. Now, you could get a similar picture in the Middle East, too. Let me just mention briefly that in the case of the PLO, we have a great deal of documentation to show how the Soviets work closely with the PLO. We have meetings of senior Soviet officials, including Andrei Gromyko, with Yasser Arafat and with Farouk Kaddoumi, Arafat's number 3 man, in which, in these documents, you get a good idea of how closely they work, because they talk about operations and strategy, political and military. We also have quite a number. We have an interview with a former Soviet foreign ministry officer who was a KGB co-optee, who worked in the Middle East in the early 70s, in which he discusses how when the Soviets in the late 60s decided to really go full force with the PLO, and how, in order to legitimize the PLO, they had their front groups making distinctions between the mainline PLO of Arafat and these extremist groups like Black September, when in fact Black September was wholly owned by Yasser Arafat, we know now after the fact. We also have in here the development growth of the paramilitary assistance from the Soviet Union and various surrogates to the PLO. And you can see in the documents captioned in Lebanon how extensive this was. For instance, one document is of a 1982 PLO East German meeting in Berlin, in which the GDR plans to provide the PLO with surface ships, presumably to come in off the water into Israel to conduct surface operations against Israel. Another document shows that the PLO military cadre in the Soviet Union, Hungary, and Bulgaria were receiving training both in conventional and unconventional operations. Now that's interesting, because southern Lebanon, in a sense, became a state within a state after 76, until the Israelis intervened in 82. And so the PLO was being groomed trained not only for unconventional combat, terrorism and things like that, but for conventional operations, so that they could consolidate control in that area. Now, not against the Israeli army, which they would be hopelessly outmanned against, but against the Christians. And so, some of the Muslim elements. And so you see that that PLO preparation was in both sides. And the equipment, by the way, that the Israelis captured in southern Lebanon clearly depicted the development of a conventional army. Now, the PLO is interesting because, unlike the Sandinistas first became a state, then they became a provider of military training and equipment to other guerrilla and insurgent groups. They were the recipients. They seized control, then they became a provider of this on behalf of Cuba and the Soviet Union. In the case of the PLO, by the late 70s, they were actually playing both roles at the same time, so that what you see is that while continuing to be the recipient of assistance to the international network of states, the PLO plays the role of supplier and almost plays a surrogate role themselves. This took the form of training cadre in camps in Lebanon. There were a large number of camps in Lebanon, still some there in the Bekaa Valley, in which terrorists and guerrillas from around the world were receiving training. One document we have in here identifies members from Salvador, from Haiti, from Southern Africa, some Turks, some Malawis receiving training in PLO camps. The camp instructors included East Germans, KGB, as well as PLO instructors. To give you an idea of how widely this cuts across the ideological spectrum, we found documents that showed support for the Japanese Red Army, very extreme terrorist group. Remember, was involved in a number of joint operations with the PLO in the early 70s. PLO providing training to the Karl-Heinz Hoffmann group, which is a neo-fascist group in Germany. So it cuts across the political spectrum. So what I would say in summary is that what we see is that the Soviet Union has developed not only their own, but a number of surrogates. And these surrogates are useful in providing a whole range of special kinds of assistance to terrorist and insurgent groups around the world. One of the interesting things in the documentation is the transition of the Sandinistas from recipient to supplier. Another interesting thing that I didn't talk about at all are the Grenada documents, where you see Grenada being groomed for this kind of role. And that's really clearly spelled out in the materials that were captured in Grenada, which we've worked through. Likewise, the PLO makes this transition. So you see a rather broad network of the Soviets and their surrogates involved in a variety of kinds of activities to promote terrorism and insurgency. And this has been a growing phenomenon. That does not mean that the Soviets call the shots and direct every group, but there's an infrastructure of support, and that support and capability is growing. And it has become, I believe, a very serious security problem for the United States. Most recently, you may be familiar, the Vice President's task force issued a report in which they say that we have not done nearly as much to protect ourselves against this threat, and this threat is going to become much more serious in the years to come and may even come into the United States. So that international terrorism has to be understood within the context of East-West relations, because international terrorists do not operate on their own. They don't have the capacity, for instance, if you take something like the Achille Lauro, they don't have the capacity to have the information and the intelligence to conduct those kinds of operations. They get that from states, and we know who those states are, and we need to be more concerned about that national security problem. I'll stop at this point.